don't stop, don't go back, just get everything down that you want to say, and then like a sculptor getting all the clay in one place, then you could start shaving it into something that is worth reading. And I define it as worth reading is by the time I'm done, if it looks like something I would want to read if I hadn't written it, and reads like it was written by a better writer than I am.
A question asked courageously, answered honestly, and lived authentically can change your whole life. For me, that question was, how can I use what I have, what I love, and what I know to bless the lives of others? The School for Good Living and this podcast are one answer to that question. Hi, I'm Brian Miller. I know that the world can work for everyone, but that it won't until it works for you. I've created this to help you make the difference you were born to make. It's a series of conversations with thought leaders who are moving humanity forward. And in each episode, I explore their lives and the work they do. I also ask them to break down how they've gotten their books written, published, and read. This podcast is all about exploring the magic and mystery, and sometimes the misery, of the creative process. So if you have a mission, a message, and the motivation to share it, this podcast is for you. Welcome to the School for Good Living. Today, my guest is Gary Taubes, author of 5 books, including The Case for Keto, Rethinking Weight Control, and the Science and Practice of Low-Carb/High-Fat Eating. Gary is the co-founder of the nonprofit Nutrition Science Initiative. He's an investigative science and health journalist. He's written a book called The Case Against Sugar, another one called Why We Get Fat, and Good Calories, Bad Calories. He is a former staff writer for Discover and correspondent for the journal Science. His writing has also appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and Esquire, and has been included in numerous best-of anthologies, including a literary companion to Science. His central hypothesis is that carbohydrates overstimulate the secretion of insulin, which causes the body to store fat. Gary studied aerospace engineering at Stanford University. He graduated from Harvard with a degree in applied physics. He earned his master's in engineering at Stanford, and he got a master's degree in journalism from Columbia. So there's no shortage of academic pedigree with Gary. As I said, he's the co-founder of the nonprofit Nutrition Science Initiative, which is a nonprofit 501c3 medical research organization dedicated to reducing the individual economic and social costs of obesity, diabetes, and related metabolic diseases by improving the quality of nutrition research. Gary's work is particularly interesting to me. Gary is an unconventional thinker. Gary is willing to question the established wisdom when it comes to what should we eat and what does it mean to be healthy and to live well. Gary studies something I'd never heard of. He calls pathological science, the science of things that aren't so. A big part of the reason Gary's work is interesting to me is that my dad died due to complications from diabetes, along with a long list of ailments that were, I believe, related to his lifestyle, his level of activity, what he ate, things that were highly treatable, if not preventable. And I know that my dad is certainly not unique in that. This is an incredible phenomenon that has happened in our culture and around the world in societies that have adopted a Western diet, over the last 100 years. And what Gary's work, what my guest's work today offers is a view into really why is that happening and what can we do about it. This conversation was recorded while Gary was in shelter in place at his home in Oakland, where he has a beautiful view of the Golden Gate Bridge. You might hear his dog in the background at one point. We've all lived through some crazy times. You can find Gary online at garytaubes.com. That's Taubes. And you can find him on Twitter at Gary Taubes. This is a broad conversation where I indulge my curiosity quite a lot if you're interested. Oh, and I do love this. I love that Gary is very interested in good science and bad science. And in his work and his writing, he attempts to get underneath the conclusions and the assumptions that scientists present to figure out not just what are they, but how were they arrived at, and what does that mean? Is there another view possible? Is there one that's maybe more accurate? And I think the sum total of that work, of that approach, is perhaps answers that might contribute to a higher quality of life, answers that will result in us being healthier, living longer, and having a higher quality of life in the process. So with that, I hope you enjoy this broad-ranging conversation with my new friend, Gary Taubes. Gary, welcome to the School for Good Living.
Brian, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I'm so glad you're here. And Gary, I want to start with my favorite question for Uber drivers, which is, what's life about?
Oof. Okay, so we're starting with the easy questions. That's good. What's life about? I can't just say 43 or whatever the answer
40,
was.
Yeah, 42, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah. See, I've added one for the 21st century. Brian, I don't know what life's about. I mean, trying to make a difference on some level, trying to lead a life that's worthwhile, that's about something more than yourself, and being challenged. My father once said, when I was about 17, he said that it was about setting challenges for yourself and then overcoming those challenges. And I said, that's ridiculous, Dad, you can just live. And in retrospect, I think he might have been right.
Your initial kind of response to your dad's answer sounds very Eastern, though. There's a very enlightened, I think, view in that. And, there's something to be said for setting goals and achieving as well.
Yeah, well, again, this 17-year-old doesn't have a very informed perspective on the universe, so.
Yeah. What was it? Someone once told me, when I was a teenager, I wasn't always right, but I was never in doubt.
Yeah, no, I can buy that. I spent a lot of time writing letters to my late father who passed away in 2000 and basically apologizing to him for all the things I was never in doubt about when I was younger, and then in retrospect, he was right.
Wow. Did you say that's a practice that you still do, or you did for a while?
No, I still do, because I've had kids late in life, so it's the process of being a parent that informs you of what parenting really is, or at least gives you the other perspective to the child-parent relationship.
Yeah, amazing how our perspective changes. I remember that's a practice that the legendary UCLA coach John Wooden did, where he would write his wife a letter every Friday and put it lovingly in her space somewhere she would find it. And even after she passed, he kept that practice up. What do you do with those letters now that he's gone?
They're just written in my head. They're not put down on paper, but they are, there's a lot of things you just don't understand when you think you know everything. So.
Yeah, for sure. Gary, when someone asks you who you are and what you do, or maybe when you're introduced from a stage, how do you like to answer that question? Purpose and identity. We're just getting the big things. Boom, right out of the way.
Well, I immediately think that when we go to cocktail parties, the instructions from my wife, don't tell anyone what you do.
Why does she say that?
Because she doesn't want me to get into a conversation about nutrition and diet, and weight. And so I think of myself as an investigative journalist who is one true expertise in the world is understanding what's called pathological science, which is the science of things that aren't so. That's when science goes awry and researchers discover the wrong things rather than the right things.
I'll bet you make a lot of friends doing that.
It goes both ways. There are very good scientists in the world who like to see people doing what I'm doing, and there are not so good scientists who don't want to be on the receiving end of what I do. It's tricky. Anyways, that's it. And then for the past 20 years, my subject has been nutrition, obesity, and chronic diseases. And I had the misfortune of concluding from my research that the conventional wisdom on all these subjects were profoundly wrong and that the science was inadequate to establish the truth. And so, now I have significant number of people out there who think that what I've done is a boon to humanity, and they're grateful that I've done it, and a significant number of authorities who think that I'm a quack, or at best a provocateur, and wish I would go away.
I'm reminded as I hear you say that about the idea that the history of human progress is the history of at least two things. One is admitting our ignorance, or ultimately accepting that we've been mistaken, that we're wrong. And whether it was Copernicus or Galileo or so many others, Bruno, that we could talk about. There's something in what you said also right there that I wanted to respond to. But anyway, okay. So I've never heard that term, pathological science. But one thing that I want to ask you about, because I do want to get to this book, The Case for Keto, Rethinking Weight Control and the Science and Practice of Low Carb, High Fat Eating. That keto is one of those things that I've heard about. You know, I know people that I respect and admire talk about it on podcasts, or I have friends that do it and they tell me how good they feel and how much weight they lose and things like this. But I myself have not ever really delved into it, any kind of particular eating regimen of any kind. So it's not just keto, but as I read your book, I'm like, wow, this is really compelling. You know, this is, and then I realize there's always at least two sides, you know, to everything. But let me ask you this, with this book, The Case for Keto, why did you write this book? Who did you write it for? And what did you want it to do for them?
Well, there's been a controversy for 150 years about the cause of obesity and the dietary lifestyle trigger of excess fat, why we get fat, which was the title of my second book. And because the conventional wisdom on obesity fails us for the most part, evidence for that is the fact that obesity and diabetes rates worldwide in the U.S. just keep climbing, regardless of the fact that we've been told for going on 100 years that we get fat because we eat too much, and the solution is to eat less and exercise more, and those seem like they should be simple things to do, and yet people continue to struggle with excess weight, usually endlessly. So I had the advantage, again, as a journalist, with a hard science background, I started investigating the subject of nutrition as a correspondent for the journal Science in 1998, and then obesity in 2001, first for a New York Times Magazine article, and then because this happened at a time when the internet had come around, I had access to, in effect, every published study and book on the subject ever written, suddenly from my office in Manhattan then. So I could do more research in 5 years than anyone else had ever done. And often breakthroughs in science and understanding happen when a new technology allows you to look in a way that nobody's ever looked. So the conclusion of my work was that, as I said, the obesity researchers embraced some assumptions that didn't really make any sense, and they passed them on from generation to generation. And our methods of treating and trying to prevent obesity are based ultimately on those assumptions. And so all of my books have addressed this in different ways. The Case for Keto is trying to put all this into perspective. And as I began arguing these first in a New York Times Magazine article, then in my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, which was published in 2007 and was 500 odd pages long with 120 pages of endnotes and bibliography. And
that's one thing, by the way, that has impressed me about your work, is that it is very well researched and substantiated. I mean, this is not, we know today anybody can get on the internet and say anything and present themselves as an authority, but your work is very well, documented. And for what it's worth, I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I mean, in this case, when you're challenging the consensus, conventionally, you can't just say, trust me.
Right.
So, and in fact, that book at one point was 400,000 words long, which would be about, 1,200 page book.
This is Good Calories, Bad Calories?
Yeah, and unfinished. Yeah. And luckily I have an amazing editor for whom I'm eternally grateful. And I said, can you read this? Because maybe we could split it into 2 books.
As are your readers, I'm sure.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
And he did read it, and he said, no, it has to be 1 book. And then he helped me cut it down. But layers upon layers of argument and counter-argument and argument and counter-argument and reference and counter-reference. And anyway, the point is, in the case against keto, I wanted to put this all into perspective. So,
no, the case for keto.
Case for keto, thank you. Yeah, the last book was the case against sugar, and I tend to get them.
Yeah.
At one point I fantasized that this book was going to be called In Defense of Fad Diets, because we've had this conflict again for 150 years between the conventional thinking on obesity and what are inevitably written off by the medical community as fad diets, from this fellow named Banting in 1865 to Atkins most famously. And today, South Beach Keto is a fad diet. The Zone was a fad diet. The Protein Power was a fad diet. Sugar Bust. They're all if they don't agree with the conventional wisdom, they're fad diets. That's how they're written off. And I wanted to put this phenomenon in perspective, so that when people were wondering what they can do to lose weight, in which all of us who are overweight and obese are in effect constantly doing, they would have a book they could go to that could put this 150 years in perspective without having to read my 500-page tome. And it would both give them guidance on how to do what appears to be necessary based on human physiology, while simultaneously putting in a kind of historical, logical framework that would help them understand why not just doing a fad diet, but maintaining a fad diet for life may be necessary, despite everything you hear from the medical dietitians, the obesity community. So that's what that book attempts to do, and we'll see if it succeeds.
Yeah, that was something, that honestly I hadn't really thought about, but your book had, that's exactly, I think the point you're making is, I say I hadn't thought about it, which means it was an unexamined assumption of mine, that it is in fact, quote, it's true that the reason people get fat, the reason we have as much obesity and chronic disease, that we have, is because people just eat too much and they don't exercise enough. Well, that's a simple narrative. And of course, this conventional wisdom is often wrong. And if it were that simple, then what that essentially amounts to is this is like a willpower problem or a self-discipline problem. And what we're not necessarily looking at is how have our diets changed over, the last 100, 200 years? How have our lifestyles changed? What's the effect of these things that we're consuming? And when I read this book, it started, me to ask myself some questions I'd never even thought of before. Like, you pose this really great question about animals eat until they're satiated. Why don't they get fat?
Yeah, so let's tell your audience first. So that's the fundamental assumption. There's a Newton's laws of obesity. It's that we get fat because we take in more calories than we expend. And what's interesting is the obesity researchers all believe that. When we overeat, there's a lot of technical terms for it. We're in positive energy balance, or, gluttony and sloth are the biblical terms. But this is the fundamental law of obesity research. And one of the points I make is that the obesity researchers don't even know where it came from. They actually assume, and I've been interviewing obesity researchers lately for a piece I hope will run in the New York Times Magazine. You could just ask them, do you know where this law comes from? And I've been told by nobody knows. Unless they read my books, nobody knows. And it actually has an origin, and that back pre-1930, roughly, there were pre-World War II, there were competing hypotheses of obesity. So one was that it's a constitutional hormonal problem. You're basically born with it. Like, some people are born predestined to become tall, and some people are born predestined to become fat, and then the environment triggers that predisposition. In which case, it's almost independent of how much people eat. So they can prevent this obesity by starving themselves. But even if they just eat as much as a lean friend eats, they'll get fat anyway. And because of this sort of constitutional predisposition. And this came to be seen as an excuse for fat people not to do what thin people do naturally, which is to eat in moderation and exercise. So by the 1920s, you had medical authorities saying that to claim obesity is hormonal was just an excuse. The line I quote in the 1960s from the Mayo Clinic authorities, it's a lame excuse for obese people not to do what thin people do.
Yeah, or as many people think, a moral failing.
A moral failing. Well, then it gets converted to a moral failing, because if they don't do what thin people do effortlessly. And there are a whole series of questions that, so the German-Austrian researchers pre-World War II were doing the best medical science in the world, had concluded that obesity had to be a constitutional defect. And this idea that it's an energy balance disorder, taking in more calories than you expend, was considered naive and nonsensical. Because when you actually work it out, let's say you gain 20 pounds every 10 years, so you gain 2 pounds of fat a year. Mm-hmm. And you go from being lean in your 20s to obese in your 40s, and many of us do.
Mm-hmm.
What you're doing is you're storing 20 extra calories of fat in your fat tissue every day that your lean friends don't. So your friends who stay lean, they manage to perfectly balance their intake to expenditure, perfectly. And those of us who get heavy, like I said, we could gain 40 pounds in 20 years and go from lean to obese. We're just storing 20 calories a day in our fat tissue. So the moral failing is this inability to prevent 20 calories a day from getting trapped in our fat tissue. And on some level, it's nonsensical if you start quantifying the size of the effect.
Yeah.
And the advantage I had, like I said, as a journalist, I could go back to textbooks in the 1920s where researchers did say, hey, when we quantify the size of the effect, this energy balance thing doesn't make any sense. The overeating thing doesn't make any sense. If I'm overeating by 20 calories a day, why can't I fix that? That's 2 bites of food.
Right.
I mean, I walk up the stairs twice instead of not at all. I fix this horrible burden of obesity, and it's an awful burden, being obese. I mean, it's a physical burden. It comes with all kinds of physiological problems, from heart disease to diabetes to gout to hypertension. I mean, nobody in an ideal world other than sumo wrestlers would want to be obese. And yet, what's necessary to fix on the day-to-day level should be trivial if you believe this energy balance idea. So that's what the whole book sort of lays out, the fact that there was a history to this idea. It was a researcher named Louis Newberg in 1929 who began insisting that obesity had to be an energy balance problem. And by post-World War II, he had sort of won out over his competitors. And he'd won out not because the science supported him, but because World War II came along and his competitors were mostly, the proponents of the constitutional hypothesis were mostly Germans and Austrians. And that school evaporated with the war. So post-World War II, everybody just bought into this idea that it's energy balance because that went along with their ideas about gluttony and sloth, and they thought people with obesity just eat too much. We know they eat too much. And you go, well, how do you know that? Well, because they're obese, right? So there's a tautological aspect to all this that no one discusses. And in this book, I wanted to lay that out and then make the argument, what we learned about the hormonal regulation of fat tissue, that by 1965 was pretty clear. And then you end up with this hypothesis that carbohydrates are fattening because they stimulate the hormone insulin, and insulin works to put fat in fat tissue and keep it there.
That makes sense to me. I mean, is that not medically agreed upon? Is that not something that we say that's what's happening?
That's quackery. What I just said is considered quackery because the conventional wisdom, if you get fat because you eat too much, then a calorie is a calorie. It doesn't matter what you eat. If you eat too much of anything, you'll get fat.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, another point you make in your book that was one, again, I'd never thought to ask, but I went, oh my gosh, yeah, that's such a great question about, if it's true that eating too much or having this caloric overshoot is what leads to obesity, then why do we all know people who are thin as a rail who can eat, way more than it seems a human being should be able to eat and stay thin?
Right. Well, that's, one of my relatives when I was younger who was very lean used to say, very lean, 6'5", couldn't get over 195 pounds if he tried. He was an athlete, so 100. And he used to say he never got stuffed. He just got bored of eating after a couple of hours.
Wow.
But if he was obese, he'd have been, he's a glutton, right? And he's overeating. The technical term for it in the medical literature is hyperphagic. He eats enormous amounts of foods, but because he wasn't obese, actually couldn't gain weight, then it's just kind of amusing how much he could eat and how much he did eat.
Well, and that's interesting too that you share that, because in the book you do talk about a friend you had who was obese who said a similar thing, right? About
he said the opposite. He said this was a young man who has a law degree from an Ivy League university. He was 400 pounds when he was 18.
Wow.
And this is a very smart young man, and he told me, he said, he didn't eat any more than his lean friends. None of them ate well. They still went to, pizza joints, but they ate as much as he did. Mm-hmm. But he accumulated 220, 30 pounds of excess fat, and they didn't. And then the question is why? I mean, that's the interesting thing about this. You can ask the question in such a way that you can come up with a completely different hypothesis of obesity very simply. So remember I said every day, if you're gaining 2 pounds of fat a year, that's 20 calories a day of fat that you're storing in your fat tissue.
Right.
So as it turns out, physiologically, you basically store most of the fat you eat. So if you eat a mixed meal of carbs and protein and fat, the fat gets stored pretty much immediately while you burn the carbs. So over the course of a day, you might store about 800 to 1,000 calories of fat in your fat tissue, and then your fat mobilizes, and then you burn that fat for fuel. So it goes into your fat tissue, and then it comes out again. And then all you have to ask is, well, why would 20 calories a day get stuck in the fat tissue? Why would it stay there?
Mm-hmm.
And the first question you'd want to ask, if you phrase the question like that, is, well, what regulates fat accumulation? What determines why the fat goes in and then the fat comes out, such that you might explain why 1,000 calories go in, and I apologize for my dog, why 1,000 calories might go in and only 980 come out every day. Whereas in my lean friends, 1,000 calories comes in and 1,000 calories comes out. So if you phrase it like that, then you say, why does 20 calories a day get trapped? Now you start thinking of obesity as a fat trapping disorder instead of a energy balance problem and how much I eat and exercise. And now you start asking questions about what hormones and enzymes and other physiological systems regulate fat accumulation.
But if I can go back to that example for just a moment, I mean, it seems to me anybody who's holding the position that you've just expressed, the one that you're writing against, is, well, they would say, well, that 20 gets stored in there because you haven't expended it. You haven't walked up the stairs twice, exactly, or something.
Right. So then you say, well, why wouldn't I walk up the stairs another 2 times?
Yeah.
You do. That's where the fat shaming comes in, by the way, because it's always the person who's asking that question is always saying, why, in effect, don't you act like I do? I eat in moderation. I keep my weight. I'm lean, so I know I balance my intake to expenditure perfectly, which means I'm either eating in moderation or I'm exercising to burn off everything I eat, and you're storing 20 calories of fat every day in your fat tissue. So ultimately you're saying, why is it I can keep my energy in balance and you can't?
Right.
And if you think that the problem is a intake expenditure problem, then why aren't you eating less or exercising more? Because I'm clearly doing what's right, you're not. And now I'm starting to fat shame because now I've turned a physiological disorder into a moral failing.
Yeah.
Either you're too stupid to know what to do, or
too lazy.
You don't care. You're too lazy. What other explanation is there? Because I do it, so why don't you? The alternative hypothesis says my body traps fat and yours doesn't. So what you do may not be relevant to what I do, because I've got, just like if I was growing to be 7 feet tall, how much weight and exercise wouldn't enter the equation of why I'm going to be 7 feet tall and you might be only 6 feet tall or 5'6" or whatever. So now we're talking about something that's outside of physiological control, or to some extent outside physiological control. We still know there's a impact of the environment, because we know people have been getting more and more obese as time goes by. So we still have to identify what the environmental trigger of this problem is.
Yeah. So, okay, so far, based on what I understand, and I don't have a deep background in nutritional science or this kind of, health science. But again, what I said earlier, when I read your book, it makes sense to me. I don't have any reason not to believe it. But what I wonder is, so it's like, say, okay, let's say that we start from where you are and we say what you're saying is true. And we find ourselves in this situation of being overweight, maybe being obese or even morbidly obese. And now we know, so we've migrated from this position of, well, this is, I'm just eating too much or not exercising enough, or both. But now I hear what Gary's saying and I want to subscribe to that. What does that mean for what I do? How does that change my behavior?
Right. Okay. So that's the question. How can I fix it? If I can fix it. And that's where, when you look at the physiology of fat accumulation, and this was studied beginning in the 1930s by some brilliant scientists, and it continued to be relevant. The work peaked by the 1960s after the tools were available to really understand what was going on. But as it turns out, the hormone insulin is the dominant hormone regulating fat accumulation. So we think of insulin as a hormone that's absent or not effective enough in diabetes, and we think of it as keeping blood sugar low. But one of the ways it keeps blood sugar low is by keeping fat locked up in the fat tissue.
So this is maybe the answer to that question of why don't my cells release that 20 calories that it...
Yeah, if you keep insulin elevated, when insulin is elevated, your fat is storing fat. That's what it does. So insulin is a sign that carbohydrates have been consumed, or protein to some extent, but we could leave that out for now. So you consume carbohydrates, that stimulates your pancreas to secrete insulin. Actually, thinking about eating carbs stimulates your pancreas to secrete insulin.
Did you say thinking about?
Thinking about
Just thinking about it.
Yeah. It's a Pavlovian phenomenon. So
holy cow! A thought can activate your internal organs like that.
Yeah. Well, just like it can activate your saliva. So start thinking about what's your favorite food.
Anything Mexican, just about.
Okay, so I don't know.
Nachos.
Nachos. Let's think about a beautiful plate of hot nachos.
Anything crunchy, cheesy, spicy, salty, and warm.
You can feel the sort of,
I do right now.
And with me, it's like hot donuts. The French call them beignets when they come out, like the
New
warm,
Orleans.
And anyway, so not only will that stimulate insulin saliva, it'll stimulate some insulin secretion, because the idea is the carbohydrates actually hit your bloodstream, your circulation, quicker than the insulin can go to work. So you want to start, it's an engineering problem, as this was described to me by the University of California, San Francisco researcher who did a lot of this work in the 1960s. You have this engineering problem where you have to basically have the insulin in your bloodstream before the carbs get there for it to do its job adequately. So you start secreting insulin just thinking about eating, and then as you start eating, you're secreting more insulin, and then by the time the carbs actually hit your bloodstream, you've got plenty of insulin there. And that insulin is telling your fat to store the fat that it's holding, not to release it into the bloodstream, so that when the blood sugar's there, the body can concentrate on burning those carbohydrates for fuel. So insulin controls all. That's the dominant controller of both glucose metabolism, carbohydrates, and fat metabolism. And as it turns out, your fat tissue is exquisitely sensitive to insulin. So that's a phrase you can see in the journal articles studying this process, exquisitely sensitive. So that means if there's the tiniest bit of insulin in your circulation, your fat tissue will try to hold on to the fat that it's stored. And so in order to lose fat, you have to minimize insulin secretion. And the way you do that by diet is by removing the carbohydrates and replacing them with dietary fat. And now you're eating a ketogenic diet. So a ketogenic diet is a diet that sort of minimizes insulin. And when you minimize insulin, you will reduce the fat you've stored. The fat will come out of your fat tissue and you'll burn it for fuel. And this is sort of relatively simple physiology. And like I said, through the 1960s, you could find researchers proposing that obesity was caused by elevated levels of insulin in the circulation. So if your insulin's a little bit elevated during the course of the day, that'll work to keep the fat stored in your fat tissue and trap it in your fat tissue, in effect. So you could imagine this cumulative process of 20 calories a day building up over decades. But the obesity people in general, these were the people who studied fat metabolism. They were different than the obesity people. And the obesity people would say, oh, people get fat because they eat too much. We know why people get fat, and anything else is an excuse.
So if I understand what you're saying, that people who studied fat metabolism, that's a different line of research than just obesity.
Yeah, so the world divided post-World War II into people who considered them obesity researchers, considered themselves obesity researchers, and they believed Newton's law of obesity, that you get fat because you eat too much. Yeah, so a ketogenic diet is a diet that minimizes insulin secretion.
So when I hear you say this, and I hear you talk about that insulin, like fat tissue is exquisitely sensitive to insulin. When insulin levels are elevated, our fat cells are holding on to fat. that this is then the mechanics of, or the physiology of obesity, not just that it's calories in and out. And that's all setting aside the thing that I think you talk about in Good Calories, Bad Calories, is that not all calories are equal. So there's also that.
Well, that's the thing. We secrete insulin in response to the carbohydrates we consume. There's some insulin secretion in response to protein, because the amino acids in protein, some of them get converted into glucose, which then stimulates insulin secretion. Fat doesn't stimulate insulin secretion.
So why is this a controversial view? Just because it's been,
well,
there's a
because we know why people get fat. They get fat because they eat too much.
Oh, yes.
Everything comes back to Newton's laws of obesity. Or
and the accepted, the established
obesity.
wisdom.
Yeah, so again, what happened in this field, so science is supposed to be self-correcting. We started off talking about we move forward by correcting errors.
Yeah.
But the problem with science is if you don't correct the error soon enough, it becomes virtually impossible to correct it because so many people believe it. It becomes, it's just, and scientists don't like, the best scientists will discuss this problem, but for the most part they don't like to because, we depend on science being self-correcting.
Right.
But you can move on from the point where it should have been corrected, and then you build layer and layer and layer of science on top of this false assumption. And if you look at articles on obesity, so for instance, back when this dogma was created, that obesity is an energy balance problem, eating too much, in effect, that was 1929, 1930 was when it started to set in, and there might have been 10 articles written a year on obesity. And there were maybe a dozen researchers in the world who were really thinking about the problem of what caused obesity and publishing on it in the medical literature. And a few of them were very smart, and a few of them were not so smart, and a few of them were critical thinkers, and a few of them were not critical thinkers. And again, I think that the non-critical thinkers won. Today, I'm guessing there's, let's say, 150 articles a week published relevant to obesity. So instead of 10 a year, you've got 7,500 a year. And it's hard, nobody can sift through all that. And all of the 7,500, maybe 7,490 are based on this idea that obesity is an energy balance disorder. That's the fundamental assumption. So even those other 10, which could be written by reasonably good scientists, are not really going to get the attention they deserve. So dogmas, belief systems perpetuate themselves as the science gets very large. You can change paradigms or belief systems when the science is small. So research when there's a large signal-to-noise ratio. So if somebody does something interesting that says that the paradigm might be wrong, that's going to be noticed by the best people in the field. And they can shift directions. But as the fields get bigger and bigger, there's more and more inertia that goes with the dogma. So the argument I've been making is obesity was basically explained in the 1960s. And linked to diet correctly in the 1960s, but the people running the field of obesity were convinced that obesity was an energy balance problem. And then we had this other phenomena where we started to believe that dietary fat caused heart disease. So on one hand, you've got human physiology arguing that carbohydrates make you fat. And on the other hand, you've got researchers arguing that dietary fat causes heart disease and we should all eat high-carb diets so that we don't get heart disease. And obesity and heart disease are very closely associated. So the ones who are arguing that dietary fat caused heart disease kind of had to argue that dietary fat causes obesity also, because you had to explain the association. So they did that as well. And the idea was that dietary fat is such dense calories that it's easier for us to overeat it, because we don't realize how many calories we're consuming when we consume a pat of butter compared to a big green salad. So we fool ourselves, and now we're stuck in this, but wait a minute, we're only fooling ourselves to 20 calories a day. Why don't we fix it? After a while, we're not going to realize that I'm fooling myself and not eat the pat of butter, and then you continue to get fatter anyway. So there's a lot of vicious cycles kicked in.
Yeah, and I think what you've said too about the inertia and the noise and this kind of thing, and certainly, health and nutrition is not the only place this happens. I mean, one of the things that I see is this idea in business is still, taught as the essential imperative for every profit-making enterprise is to maximize shareholder value, established in a very different era when capital was scarce.
I have to say, if I knew anything about business or profit, I would not have become a journalist. Okay?
I do want to ask you this too, why you do this work, but
it's another thing. I was going to say that you don't know any better when you're young and make these decisions.
Yeah. Well, I certainly see, a parallel in what you're saying about here's this established line of thinking that's so broadly accepted that it's not disputed. It's only built upon layer, perhaps, of misbelief. And for me, I see parallels, whether it's in economics, and you can look back, and I'm certainly not an economist or an economic historian, but we can look back at individual thinkers who put forth a truth, and then we've just, as a society, moved that direction. Or similarly in business, where in virtually every business school around the globe, it's not even questioned that the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder value, not to ensure the social good or elevate the human spirit. But as we see, that's changing, and we are in a time, where things are being questioned and changed. But I'm reminded too, and clearly this didn't happen with one funeral, but of the famous scientific adage attributed to Max Planck about science advances one funeral at a time.
Right. And it does, but those people who are dying off are teaching younger generations what they believe. And not only are they teaching younger generations what they believe, they're teaching younger generations how they think science should be done. And so there's a possibility that in some fields scientific progress has been derailed in a way that is going to be very hard to bring it back on the rails. I mean, this is so sensitive subject. You're in Utah, and my second book ever was on cold fusion.
Yeah, that's right. That work here at the University of Utah.
Yeah, and at Brigham Young University. And I spent 3 years on this. I get obsessed. And you could imagine a scenario in which the entire world of science was Utah. So you didn't have all these other scientists responding to the cold fusion announcement by trying to see if it was correct and setting up their own experiments, because it was relatively inexpensive to try and replicate these experiments. A lot of people did, and some very good scientists did, and they said, wait, this can't be replicated. And not only can it not be replicated, we can see what mistakes the Utah chemists had made. And so over the course of 3 months, you saw science self-correct. So there's a claim of a great discovery. We run these currents through this beaker of heavy water with a palladium electrode, and we get cold nuclear fusion, and it's the wealth of OPEC that we've got in our laboratory. And then the scientific method kicks into action, and it very quickly gets refuted. If those other people didn't exist, you could imagine a scenario where in cold fusion research becomes sort of the norm. It's accepted that it's correct. And the people who are considered good scientists are the ones who get the right answer, which is that it's correct. And they build into their scientific process certain flaws in the scientific method and even doing the experiments that are considered the norm because they're what you have to do to get the right answer. And then 50 years later, you have a world of research, a scientific community, all trained and based on this idea that cold fusion is real and that you have to do sloppy experiments to get the right answer, and you don't need to do rigorous controls, and you don't need to understand your background and all the things that good scientists think about all the time. And then somebody comes along and says, no, wait, cold fusion isn't real. And they're the quack, because everybody in the community believes the same thing, and they get a great deal of respect because they believe it. And they respect, the idea of groupthink is that you tend to respect people who agree with you. You think they're the smart ones because they agree with me. And so you surround yourself with people who think just like you do, and you get positive reinforcement from the people who think like you do. And when you have to put on committees to, review the state of the science, the committees are all staffed by people who think exactly like you do. And so if there are assumptions built into the dogma that are wrong or have never been tested, they continue to get passed on to future generations because everybody involved in creating that dogma thinks exactly alike. The more you think about this, the more pessimistic you can become. And yet simultaneously, we've clearly made great progress in science. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you pointed out that, that situation here with cold fusion was, science functioned as we hope it would, that others, tested and shared what they knew. And it's kind of like Wikipedia that I've seen attempts to kind of game Wikipedia, putting facts in there that are clearly not true. Like I think there was that famous one about an elephant only has 3 legs. And sure enough, the group, that crowd editorial, corrected. But I'm on a little bit of a tangent. I want to pace us. I'm going to shift a little bit. I want to pace us here because I've got a few questions that I want to be sure to ask before we leave this section. But one of them is this. One of them is, why have you devoted your life or so much of your life to this work? Why did you get into it? Why have you stayed on it?
Okay, I went into journalism because, well, first of all, I would have been a lousy physicist. I had a physics degree in college. I got a C- in quantum physics my junior year, and my advisor kindly suggested I find another career. I read all the President's Men, the Woodward Bernstein book about
the Watergate,
Nixon and Watergate,
yep.
And I had been a reader of private detective fiction, Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, and I watched Humphrey Bogart movies where he played, Sam Spade or Philip Marlowe, and then I read all the President's Men and decided I wanted to be an investigative journalist. So I got into Columbia Journalism School because it was a time, even though I hadn't worked for any newspapers or school papers, it was a time when science writing was seen as the future of science, and I had science degrees from Harvard and Stanford, so it looked like I knew what I was doing or that I was smarter than I am. And coming out of Columbia, I wanted to be an investigative journalist, but I couldn't get any real job, so I took a job at Discover Magazine in New York, writing about science, and a few years in, it became clear that there was some terrible science out there, and you didn't need a PhD in the subject to ask what seemed like obvious critical questions of the researchers and maybe clarify some of the problems. So like any occupation, plumbing, road building, pick it. There are people do it well and people do it poorly, and the same is true of science. In general, they might be more intelligent than others, although every time the plumber came to my house when I was a kid, my father had a PhD. After he paid the bill, says he should have gone into plumbing. Anyway, so that was it. There's good science and bad science. My first book, I went to live in Geneva at this physics laboratory called CERN outside of Geneva, Switzerland. I thought I was going to chronicle a great discovery being made, and instead it turned out that the scientists had screwed up, the physicists. They'd made mistakes, and I spent 10 months, today we would say I was embedded with the physicists, and I watched them realize over the course of 10 months that they had made a mistake and embarrassed themselves.
Was this with the Hadron Super Collider?
Yeah, at the time it was the 2 generations of particle accelerator prior to the Large Hadron Collider. So they've had one other collider there. At the time, it was state of the art. This was 1984, 85. And I thought I was going to, like I said, chronicling this great discovery. And it's funny, I got panned in the New York Times by the New York Times reviewer Christopher Lehman Hout, who clearly didn't like my attitude. You could imagine him writing this pan while he looked at the book picture and smacking me, my photo. But from my perspective, I thought I was going to go out and write about this great discovery, and instead I found myself in this sort of political quagmire with this Machiavellian, brilliant group leader who had made more mistakes than he had ever done right, and I had to write what I saw. Wow. And I became obsessed with this question of how hard it is to do science right and how easy it is to get the wrong answer. So when that book came out, whenever I had the opportunity to do an investigation into some controversial science, often researchers, I would be telling people, the physicist I was writing about, the head of the experiment was a guy named Carlo Rubbia, who won the Nobel Prize while I was there for earlier work that was mostly wrong. I went to Stockholm with him, something I'm sure he still regrets to this day. I would tell people, I would talk about Ruby, and they'd say, oh, you think Ruby was bad? You should write about so-and-so. In every field of science, there was some sort of hyper-ambitious researcher who cut just enough corners to keep ahead, never actually committing fraud, but committing a kind of scientific malpractice, not misconduct, but malpractice, where he's getting newsworthy results that are wrong. But using those newsworthy results to get funding to do future work and sort of accumulate prizes and awards. So whenever people told me about those researchers, I was always, now I got to do investigative science writing. Remember, I wanted to be an investigative journalist. So I just kept at it. And then in the late 90s, I stumbled into nutrition. And the nutrition science turned out not just to be terrible, but there was a real human cost to it. So now, how do you get out? Once you've decided that the conventional wisdom's wrong, and that people are getting harmed every day because they're not just following the conventional wisdom, they believe its implications.
Yeah.
So if the implication is obesity is a moral failure and you're obese, there are people out there who are burdened every day by their belief that they've failed themselves, that it's their fault.
Mm-hmm.
And so now it just gets hard to walk away, and I envy the people who can do it, but I haven't been able to. So on some level, this then becomes a cause, and then, a journalist with a cause is no longer perceived as an unbiased journalist, so then you get into other tricky aspects of this work.
Yeah, that was something that struck me in the intro of your book, where you make the statement, we believe, talking about those of us who, particularly the physicians and dietitians on the front line, believe that the advice we get from our public health, nutritional, and medical authorities is simply wrong, that we believe an injustice is being perpetrated that has to be righted. So I definitely had that sense of mission or cause. And then you say, my goal is to help each of us shed a century of tragic preconceptions about the nature of a healthy diet, to learn to ignore the bad advice we have been given, and to replace it with a way of thinking about diets, our weight, and our health that works. That really resonates with me because maybe I'm a contrarian in some ways, but I've always loved the saying attributed to Mark Twain about when you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to reform. Not to be a contrarian, just to be a contrarian, but I am struck by how often the conventional thinking, either it's flat out wrong, or at least there's more to it, and you're presenting that.
As a journalist, I'm always trying to make statements that are factually correct. And the way journalists can do that is you use a lot of caveats. So by saying, we believe this, that's true. That is a factually correct statement. We believe this. And in effect, I'm always writing to my critics, because my critics are often saying, well, Taubes says this is true. And then I go, no, look what I said. I said, we believe this is true. That's factually correct. Whether it is or not is going to be up to other people to decide. But this is our position. That's when I told you I wrote this book in part to put all of this into perspective. And it's 100 years of, it sounds hubristic and arrogant, and I get it. But there have been some horrible mistakes made in this field. And like I said, we're just, the assumption with these increasing levels of obesity and diabetes is that, the relevant research community will go through all kinds of rhetorical contortions to try and explain it without blaming people for being obese and diabetic. But if you believe that obesity is caused by this energy imbalance, then one way or the other, it's the fault of the obese and the diabetic individual for getting that way. They'll blame it on the food system. So there's a book, the idea, what's called Sugar, Fat, Salt, by a new Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times writer, Michael Moss. And the idea is the food system. The food industry works so hard to make these foods so blissful. He talks about the bliss point, that you just can't say no. But the assumption is clearly thin people can say no because they don't overeat it. So you can blame it on the food industry, but it's still those of us who get fat who are the ones who have failed, who they've won out over. And we can't say no, but the thin people can. There's no way to escape the moral implications of this energy balance idea. And as long as we have, and the researchers can't do their job correctly, because it's like everything they do, they set up from setting up their experiments to interpreting their experiments, they do on this belief system that people get fat because they eat too much.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, that if all of that work is occurring inside a paradigm, you're not going to escape the paradigm.
You're not going to escape it.
You're just going to
Exactly.
validate it.
Yeah, and it's funny, when I was writing about cold fusion, one of my lessons that I took away from science journalists was for young science journalists, and I would often give talks to journalism schools, and I'd say, if anyone ever evokes Galileo as a personal role model, assume they're a quack until remarkable evidence argues otherwise. And then I'd be writing about this, and people are interviewing me, and they'd say, well, give me another example where the paradigm was so incorrect that, and you go, well, I mean, it's kind of like if you thought that the sun rotated around the earth. I mean, you look out the window, it clearly rotates around the earth. I mean, it's an easy mistake to make, and you could imagine how and now I'm using, even though I'm not saying it, I'm evoking Galileo as some kind of role model, and it's like, I can't go there, right? And that's one of the problems with this kind of claim, is that I was talking to a journalist yesterday who was doing an article for Wired, and this is where it gets tricky, because simultaneously I'm writing an article for I am a journalist writing an article for the New York Times Magazine on this overeating ideas, where it comes from, why it's clearly wrong, how tautological it is. And I sent him the draft, and I want his comments because he's a good journalist and I trust his judgments. But I also said, I can't possibly be right. It can't be this simple. And you can't be the only person in the world who and I'm not the only one, but there's, in the research community, there's maybe 5 people who haven't read my work who think like I do because they've come to the same conclusions. And clearly I've got to be a quack, right? I mean, it's just, there's no way to avoid it. People and yet the logic seems kind of indisputable. And this guy doesn't want to take a side. And I kept saying, but look, obesity, it's the overeating hypothesis, it's either a tautology or it's not. You don't need experiments. The metaphor I use is, imagine if we were talking about wealth, like you and I were. I probably say this in the book. You were doing a podcast, and I was an authority on wealth accumulation, and I was helping your listeners come to understand how to get as wealthy as possible while simultaneously, putting that wealth to work for humanity. And you said, well, how do people get wealthy? And I said, well, they have to make more money than they spend. And that was it. And then I'd look at you and you'd say, well, that's absurd. Of course they have to make much more money than they spend, right? That's the definition of accumulating wealth. You haven't given me an explanation. And obesity, if I tell you they got fat because they take in more energy than they expend, it's like, that's the answer. That's Newton's law. It's not helpful. It just explains nothing. It is literally tautological, and yet that's been the dogma for going on 100 years. Well, since World War II.
Well, I know we've been talking about this for an hour already, but something I feel like I'm not yet clear on, and maybe it's so simple that there's nothing more to grasp, but I think, okay, so if I'm following what you're saying, that, this obesity, hypothesis is not accurate, and what you're saying about insulin is in fact why we get fat. And then I go, okay, so is the answer as simple as cutting out these simple sugars, these carbs, these things that elevate our insulin, and then we live avoiding all those foods that are so cheap and delicious and easily accessible, that some of which I would miss dearly, but in the name of being healthy, not just thin, but healthy, and have longevity and quality of life, I think I would do that. Is that it? I mean, is it really that simple that I just cut out all that stuff that these big food companies are trying to push on me, and boom.
Well, it's okay. On one level, it is that simple, but then I'm going to complicate it instantly. So first of all, you have to replace those calories with something.
Right.
Because otherwise, if you just cut out the crap, you're going to be hungry. Because a lot of
I would be sad.
You get over the sadness. Look, my advantage in writing about this stuff is I have a caffeine addiction, that's clear, and I had a nicotine addiction. And when you're a smoker, you can't imagine life without cigarettes. I mean, the negative feedback tends to be worse than the negative feedback of the crap you eat, because your breath is terrible, your mouth feels awful when you wake up in the mornings. You might have I used to wake up at 3 a.m. coughing. I sounded like my father, which I didn't want to do at 40.
Yeah, I used to smoke too.
Yeah, so that's the thing. There was a period in which you couldn't imagine not being a smoker, much as you wanted to not be a smoker. I mean, someday I would like to go back and live in Paris, where I had the fortune of living when I was writing my first book. And I can't imagine sitting at French cafes and not going back to smoking cigarettes. I miss cigarettes more than I miss bread. And I quit 20 years ago. I miss cigarettes more than I miss ice cream. I mean, if I talk about it enough and I think about it, and we went out to dinner and my wife ordered dessert and I didn't, because I'm always trying to be virtuous, I'm going to crave that dessert. And now I'm going to start sort of missing it in a sense, because it's there. Whereas if my wife were to smoke a cigarette, I would probably be slightly nauseated. So there are different phenomena going on, but you get over it. In effect, like any addiction, you learn. But that's the point, one of the problems with these diets, remember I said carbohydrates stimulate insulin secretion, fat doesn't. So a ketogenic diet replaces the carbs with fat. It's not a high protein diet, because a high protein also can stimulate insulin secretion. It's a high-fat diet. And so since the 1960s, we've been taught that dietary fat will kill us and make us fat. But the idea is saturated fat from animal products in particular, going to cause heart disease and other chronic diseases. So that's another aspect of the conventional wisdom.
And that is accurate, though, isn't it?
No.
Saturated fat causes heart disease. I thought that was just as sure as, it's not so?
No.
You're blowing my mind, man.
Well, this is how I remember I said I sort of stumbled into nutrition. First article I did was on this controversy. Diet salt causing hypertension.
Is this what if it's all been a big fat lie? Is that this article you're saying?
No, well, that was the first sort of obesity article. Before that, I did 2 investigations. Again, I was a correspondent for the journal Science, and I spent 9 months on one magazine article about whether salt causes high blood pressure. I didn't realize there was a controversy over this, which there was, and there still is. It was a conventional wisdom. I ate a low-salt diet like everyone else did in the 90s. But it turns out that there are people who think the science is terrible. So this was interesting to me, because I was interested in good and bad science. So I spent 9 months. I interviewed 85 researchers and administrators for one magazine article. I mean, these are crazy numbers, by the way. The science was terrible. There was an interesting hypothesis that was put forth in the 1960s, and every time they tried to test the hypothesis, they failed. It failed. So while I was doing that story, one of the worst scientists I'd ever interviewed, and I thought, the Cold Fusion book was called Bad Science. I thought I had interviewed the worst scientist in the world when I was doing that, because something like Cold Fusion attracts the worst scientists to it. The president of the University of Utah at the time, Chase Peterson, it was his metaphor, like flies to shit. And I apologize, Chase, I didn't put that in the book, and he's now passed on. So one of the worst scientists I ever interviewed took credit for getting Americans not just to eat less salt, but putting us on this low-fat diet we were all eating. And I literally got off the phone with this guy, and I called up my editor at Science. I said, when I'm done writing about salt, I'm going to write about fat, because if this guy was involved in any substantive way, there's really got to be a good story there. I had no idea what it was. So I spent a year on the dietary fat story. I funded it by freelancing. I used to write speeches and press releases for IBM in my spare time, and that would help fund, my pro bono work, which was a fat story. And I interviewed about 140 people for that story. Again, researchers. And when I say administrators at the USDA or the National Institutes of Health, or congressional staffers who were involved in this. And the science is just terrible. It's just really, again, it was an interesting hypothesis, and they did a series of randomized controlled trials, experiments in effect, to test the hypothesis, and they just failed to confirm it. But the problem in this field is once people start to believe something, they can't get off it.
That sounds very human. That's very normal for human beings.
It is very human. Well, at one point in this process, around 2000, I said, this is crazy. Whatever's happening to me is crazy, because if I understand how to do science, these scientists that I'm, quote, scientists that I'm writing about don't. And I went back and I started reading philosophy of science books going all the way back to Francis Bacon. So in 1620, 400 years ago this year, Francis Bacon published a book called Novum Organum, which Latin for sort of new technology of reasoning. And it was the sort of initiation of the scientific method. It's not enough to just believe what authority figures tell us, and it's not enough to just believe what we think is true. We have to test it experimentally. And everything Bacon talked about 400 years ago was the same stuff people who study cognitive, errors talk about today. We believe what we want to believe. We see in the data what we want to see in the data. We select out the evidence that agrees with us while we might ignore a greater amount of evidence that disagrees. And everything he was talking about in 1620 was what I was documenting in the dietary fat story. So no, saturated fat, as far as I can tell, is not the reason why we have heart attacks. And then the reason would be the refined sugars and grains in our diet.
Yeah, and again, to me, when I look at what's happened in our society, this incredible incidence of these diseases, cancer, cardiac disease, obesity, diabetes, all these things, and how that has been coincidental with the change in what we eat. That's not hard for me to accept, at least the possibility of what you're saying.
Right, but again, sure. Everyone looks at it. So if you believe the conventional wisdom, you look at how the diets and lifestyles have changed in 120 years since, say, 1900. And you say, well, we consume more saturated fat and we consume fewer carbohydrates, which is true. And we're less physically active, right? Because we have all these labor-saving devices. We're not out in the fields, we're not.
Yeah, most of us are knowledge workers.
Yeah, exactly. So we're sedentary. We eat more. There's more food available, and the food we eat, there's more fat in it and fewer carbs. So therefore, we get fat because we eat more and can expend less, and we get heart disease because there's more dietary fat, less carbs. That was the basic observation of the low-fat movement. The flip side is you say, well, yeah, we eat less carbs, but the carbs we eat are more highly refined. So you go from eating relatively stone ground flour and relatively unrefined bread to white bread, and you dump a whole lot of sugar into the diet. So even though in quantity we eat less carbs than we did in 1900, those carbs are now predominantly white flour and sugar and liquid sugar. Yeah. And in the 1960s, we just transformed, like kids in particular, children's diets in the 1960s became dessert. Sugary cereals, juices, fruity yogurts. You look at what we feed kids, and it's what earlier generations considered dessert and a treat and something you would have once a week. So the alternative hypothesis, it's got nothing to do with the fat and the saturated fat. It's all the sugar and refined carbs. And then you look at things like, obesity and diabetes, and they're insulin related, and insulin is stimulated in response to the carbohydrate content of the diet. There's evidence that sugar itself might cause a condition called insulin resistance. So there's a whole series of observations that feed into what I've been arguing and others, whereas the conventional wisdom was basically based on, hey, look, we're having, a lot of heart attacks in the United States, and when I look at the USDA data from 1900, we're eating less carbs and more fat, it must be the fat. And then there's a LDL cholesterol story and statins, and the drug industry gets involved, and But the science is just terrible. That's all. That's the one thing I know better. I have studied as much or more than any human being in the world is this concept of pathological science, the science of things that aren't so, as it was originally defined.
Mm.
And nutrition does pathological science as well or as poorly as any field in the world.
You should say pathological science is the science of things that aren't so.
Yeah, that was the definition. It was a term coined by a chemist named Irving Langmuir, Nobel laureate chemist. He gave a famous lecture on famous in the science community, lecture on pathological science at IBM, coincidentally, in like 1953, I think it was. And then
Wow.
I first heard about this lecture during the cold fusion period, because the cold fusion was an example of pathological science.
Well, Gary, I'm not doing an effective job of pacing us, but I'm definitely enjoying our conversation. I just want to acknowledge that. I want to ask one more question and share one more thing in this section. It's actually two questions, because one is if there's anything more you feel is worth saying, not that we can't come back, but on anything we've talked about or haven't to this point. But before I go there, I want to ask you this. You make this point, like, I wonder how much of this is, I don't know if it's a branding issue, a messaging, because you make the point that this term I can barely even pronounce it, LCHF, low carb, high fat, LCHF/keto, like, that's not a sexy, there's nothing there that is memorable or catchy per se. And I think of it maybe like climate change or global warming, where the words we use have a lot to do with how we perceive it, how we think about it. And so it's easy, I think, for people to be climate deniers when they're saying, well, yeah, climate change has always happened. It's not a thing we should worry about or take action on. And I wonder how much of everything you're saying that's being ignored or actively, resisted, is because of what we're calling it. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's, on some level, that's always true. So in science, in good science, it's vitally important to be specific in your language and your definition of terms, because you can build assumptions into the terms you use to describe a problem, and then people who embrace those terminology will embrace the assumptions with it without even knowing it.
Right.
So you want to minimize the assumptions. That's always one of the goals. And so, there's some things you just can't get rid of, but in an ideal world, everything is tested, nothing is assumed. And just for the low carb, high fat / ketogenic, the way the book is called The Case for Keto. But one of the things I did for the book was I interviewed about 120 odd physicians who have converted to this way of thinking. And so they eat low carb, high fat, ketogenic diets themselves, and they prescribe those diets to their patients. And it's ultimately, as I say in the book, it's about, this idea that carbohydrates are fattening. So for those of us who put on weight easily, who fatten easily, it's the carbohydrates in the diet that do it. They're not fattening to everyone, because clearly the world is full of thin people who can eat these foods with impunity. Mm-hmm. But for those of us who get fat, the argument is carbohydrates are the problem, so we can't eat them. And then we have to replace them with fat. And now we may or may not be eating a ketogenic diet. This is part of the confusion. The physicians who prescribe these diets to their patients, they want to get their patients off the crap carbohydrates. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing. So if I can get them off the crap breakfast cereals and the juices and the high carb snacks and the white bread and, ideally bread in general, I'll make them healthier. They'll be healthier, they'll live longer, they'll feel better. That's step one. And if I can get them to replace it with fat and lower the carbs enough, they'll lose weight. And we don't know how much that has to be, because it's different for everyone. So I'm just trying to, even though the book is called The Case for Keto, which is as much the ad people at the publisher is my choice, it's really about this idea that carbohydrates are fattening, and that if you're put on fat easily, you shouldn't, and you don't want to put on fat, then you shouldn't eat them. Then they're the thing you avoid in the diet, that's all. So by using both terms, low carb, high fat / keto, ketogenic, I'm embracing the whole concept, so people know. If I just call it a ketogenic diet, well, often these diets are not actually, there's a there's a definition of what a ketogenic diet is, which is that you're generating a significant number of ketones from your liver, and you might not be doing that, but you might still be on a low-carb, high-fat diet. So, but always in science, in any writing, you should be specific in your terminology. And I've seen so much damage done in this field by people who aren't. So much, beliefs are carried along by terminology.
Yeah.
And you see it when you study the history, you see how it happens. It's just the lazy use of terminology allows people to continue believing things that aren't necessarily true. And all you have to do is define your terms more clearly and precisely, and that won't happen.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I love the succinct way that you talk about that, where assumptions get embedded into terminology, Yeah, that makes sense to me. And something, I know I said this in my letter when I invited you to this interview, is just that, my dad, who passed away at 64 years old with a long list of health ailments, including diabetes, that was severe enough that he had his legs amputated below the knees before he died. I just want to share that I really do think what you're doing, the work you're doing, is so important, because I know there's a lot of people suffering, and they're doing the best they can, looking to authorities that they trust for information that clearly is not serving them. And, I'm interested in who is saying something, not just new and different, but something that will actually lead to a higher quality of life for people. And as far as I can tell, what you're writing about and the ideas you're promoting, they're doing that. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the goal of the book. I say in the beginning of the book, I'm writing it as for people who are, overweight, obese, who have metabolic diseases like diabetes or prediabetes, but also for their physicians. The conventional wisdom in medicine is the doctors are taught to trust the authority figures, and if the authority figures are saying this is quackery, that's what they believe.
Yeah.
And if they think that people are going to die doing these diets, that's what they believe, despite roughly 100 clinical trials arguing that they're possibly the healthiest way most of us can eat. And so what I'm trying to do is open minds to the point that physicians will want to learn more about it and will want to experiment. They feel free to let their patients experiment with these diets and help them rather than talk them out of it. And this is happening anyway.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, and we didn't talk about the flip side, is there's a very powerful vegan vegetarian movement in this country. And we're blaming the chronic diseases that are so prevalent in our societies on refined grains and sugars for the most part. And some of the people, my allies, think vegetable oils are to blame as well. And then there's a vegan vegetarian movement that says the problem is animal products. So the easiest way to eat a ketogenic diet, a low-carb, high-fat diet, is to eat a lot of animal products, because they tend to be combinations of protein and fat. They don't have carbs involved. It can be done with a vegetarian, even a vegan diet, and there are a lot of people doing it, but it's a lot more difficult.
Yeah, I stopped eating meat completely a few years ago, so I'm in this camp, not vegan, but vegetarian.
Right.
So this is where I lean in, especially hearing, what you're saying, going, okay, now if I really adopted this keto, LCHF keto approach as a vegetarian, then what? Because
it can be done. It can be done. It's a lot more difficult. It's easier as a vegetarian or a lacto-ovo vegetarian or a pescatarian. As a vegan, there's a Facebook group with I think 50,000 members who are vegans on ketogenic diets. One of the physicians I interviewed for the book, who was sort of my back doctor in absentia, she's in Ohio, and when I have back problems, which I was an athlete my whole life, I often do, she's the first one I go to, and she's a vegan on a ketogenic diet. But as she says, it's not about religion for her. She just doesn't feel good when she eats animal products. She can't seem to tolerate them. But that's the sort of, these two growing movements, or the people doing keto who, most of them, some of them are young kids who think it'll enhance their athletic performance, and maybe it will, and some want to live forever, and maybe it'll help them live longer. But most of them are people who just, we can maintain a healthy weight. Like I can maintain a healthy weight and appear to be very healthy if I eat this way. And then on the other hand, there's like I said, a vegetarian vegan movement that's arguing something very different.
Yeah.
And with a sort of ethical, moral position and an environmental position tied into it that gives it power.
Yeah.
What worries me, it's like one of my oldest friends called me the other day. He became a vegan about a week ago, and he wants to talk about it. And we all have too much time on our hands now, right? Because we're trapped at home, and I don't, but I will. But I worry that people who would benefit, who would be healthier, eating a animal product-based diet that's very low in carbs, because vegetables are, plants are, most of the calories are coming from carbohydrates one way or the other. Yeah. So they're slower, they're bound up with fiber if you're eating a healthy vegetarian or vegan diet.
But they're still carbs.
So people, I think that's a healthy diet for people, but it wouldn't reverse their metabolic diseases, whereas a low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic diet would. Yeah. And would be healthier. And so there's a lot of mixed messages, and there's a sort of conflict between these two schools, because if we're right, they're wrong. Not that it can't be a healthy diet, but the fundamental beliefs on which the diet is based could be wrong. Yeah. And if they're right, then we're wrong.
Yeah, and then in the mix of all of this, not this preponderance of data and information is then the individuality of every one of our bodies, which I'm certainly not an expert on, but I've seen enough of the Eat Right for Your Type and the different blood type diets and all this kind of thing. It's like, holy cow, in some ways, this does seem very complex.
Yeah, although there's a way to simplify it. So my previous book before the case for keto was the case against sugar, against publishers like these themes. The way I put it in that book, so you have an observation you want to explain, like a crime that's been committed. Mm-hmm. And in this case, the observation/crime is the appearance of these what are called Western diseases in every population in the world that transitions from eating its traditional diet to a Western diet and lifestyle. So Native Americans of the Great Plains or the Southwest of the United States, or the Utes of Utah, or the Inuits and the First Nations people, and Southeast Asians and South Pacific Islanders and African tribal populations, they go from whatever they were eating, and you give them Western diets, and you see obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, arthritis, gout, you name it, explode in the populations, hypertension. And this has been a observation since the late 19th century. It's documented in different medical specialties, like in people studying hypertension, nephrologists, as soon as they have a tool to, measure blood pressure, they're off measuring blood pressure in, Middle Eastern tribal populations in the 1920s, and saying their blood pressure is lower if they're still nomads than it is if they've settled in, a local city and are eating Western foods. So then the question is, what is it about these Western diets and lifestyles trigger this manifestation of obesity and diabetes and heart disease? And that's a different question. So now everybody's different in the population, but add a Western diet to everybody and you get obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. So is it different for everyone? Like, you're triggered by the animal products and I'm triggered by the Coca-Colas and she's triggered by the soy oil, or is it the same thing for all of us? Yeah. And
there's some things
Occam's
that do.
razor is so, and that's why, like I said, on one level, some people will say, well, it's the red meat.
Right.
And I'll say, well, wait a minute, but you had like the Native Americans of the Great Plains lived on buffalo, put them in a reservation, feed them Western foods. Can't be the red meat because they were eating red meat when they didn't have these diseases. Yeah. Got to be something else. And the something else, the prime suspects were white flour and sugar. Add white flour and sugar to any population's diet, and eventually you'll get obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, arthritis, and they're all linked to what's called insulin resistance, which is the fundamental defect in diabetes, and I would argue on some level the fundamental defect in obesity. And so there's a story that's a compelling story. The conventional wisdom, by the way, is they become sedentary and they eat too much, and then the meat causes gout, and the fat causes heart disease, and the salt causes hypertension.
Yeah.
And
the thing that's so maybe difficult to tease out on this is I think it probably is also true that they're sedentary and eat too much. But
well, it's also true that they're sedentary and eat on average more.
Right.
But there's also this observation. Breaks my heart. I can't get this into the New York Times Magazine story, but maybe I'll be able to in the next draft. This is if they run it. By the time this comes out, they may have killed it. The dual burden of obesity and malnutrition. So this is obesity and malnutrition and undernutrition existing in the same populations, in the same families, even simultaneously.
In the same individuals?
Well,
or just in the same family?
Arguably in the same individuals. What it means is you'll have mothers, for instance, who are obese with children who are clearly starving and undernutrition. Their growth is stunted. So they're not just that they're not getting enough protein, enough necessary vitamins and minerals, they're not getting enough calories, and yet their mothers are obese. So this is now a major health problem all over the world. Basically, a lower economic status populations all over the world suffer this dual burden. When I went looking for it in the research to my book, I could find it documented as early as 1902 in the Pima, the Native American tribe called the Pima, and then again in 1928 in the Sioux tribe. These populations are poor beyond our imagination. I mean, literally beyond. We could not imagine the poverty. In the case of the Sioux in 1928, there was a government report in 1928 that said that back then people would not be able to imagine the poverty on this reservation, and yet 25% of the mothers are obese. So how do you define, what does it mean to overeat in a population that's so poor that the kids are starving? And if you believe that obesity is an energy balance problem, the mothers did overeat. How do you know that? Because they're fat. They had to overeat. End of story. We don't have to describe anything else. And then you say, but the kids are starving. Why didn't they give some of the superfluous food to the kids? Right?
Yeah.
That's what I would do. I'd like to think that's what I would do.
Yeah.
If my children were starving and I was eating Snickers bars, give it to the kids. Anyway, so that's the kind of paradox that you have in this field that tends to be ignored.
Well, and globally, I've seen that on a global scale about how remarkable it is that there are still famines that occur, although Yuval Noah Harari pointed out that any one of those that occur now are politically motivated, which was interesting. But the fact that we live on a planet where people do lack nutrition or access to some of these basic things, water, sanitation, while so much of the developed world lives with all of these preventable, maybe lifestyle diseases. And the paradox of that not quite 50-50, but half the world is dying of, the obesity and other related ailments, and then half is starving. And it's like, that is amazing.
Yeah. And again, you can find, and that's the point, you can go into these populations. My favorite example was Western Saharan refugees living in refugee camps in Algeria in the Sahara Desert. So they were chased out of this population, that there was a revolution in their country. They're chased out, and I think it was the 1970s. And for 30 years, they've been living in these refugee camps when the study was done, it was 35 years, refugee camps in the Sahara Desert. And all the food has to be shipped in, by health organizations, basically in trucks over the desert because you can't grow anything. And so the kids are clearly undernourished, they're stunted, they're vitamin and mineral deficiency diseases, and yet 25-30% of the women are obese. What's going on? I mean, clearly this idea that they eat too much food and that's why they're fat can't really explain it.
Yeah.
But when you look at what they are eating, the food that they're shipping in in the trucks are all refined carbs and sugars, because that's not going to spoil. And the researcher who led the study said, now that I think about it, they basically lived on tea iced tea, cold
Wow.
tea, and they would put like 3 or 4 teaspoons of sugar into every glass of tea that they drank.
Wow.
Okay, well, maybe now we can understand it.
Yeah. Something that I hadn't realized, I'd never thought of until I read a book called Secret Life of Plants. I don't know if you happen to read it. It was like 34 years ago. And it talked about, I didn't expect the book to go in this direction, but when it talked about preservatives that came into our foods and white sugar, and it talked about the fact that the reason these foods have such an incredibly long shelf life is because there's no life in the food. If you look at food that's alive, it spoils very quickly.
And there's nothing that the rodents and the insects really want to eat.
Yeah. So I
that
know there's
was
this.
the idea that you could ship sugar and white flour around the world, just put it in bins,
Yeah.
and you could ship it around the world and it won't go bad. So you could use it to trade with populations on the way because it wasn't going to go bad, it wasn't going to spoil.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And I realized, and we won't attempt to explore this at all. I don't know that either one of us are qualified anyway, but about the whole maybe Ayurvedic and, this other aspect of what is in the energy and the life of the food that we're consuming. But
yeah, well, no, that's beyond my
yeah. Last night at dinner, just on the topic of veganism, and then we're going to transition to the lightning round. I'll ask you 1 or 2 questions about writing, and then we'll wrap up. Are you good? Are you good with that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I know we've gone long, but I've just enjoyed this, and I'm learning so much from you. At dinner last night, my wife prepared this chorizo, and it's a vegan chorizo. And so my 13-year-old son, like, you have this 10-year-old son. They both love basketball.
11-year-old and a 14-year-old, yeah.
His refrain always is there meat? Is this meat? And there's never meat. It's not meat, right? But he says to our 6-year-old who didn't eat her vegan chorizo, there are vegans out there right now who don't have vegan meat. Oh my gosh. And he was totally serious. That was great. Anyway. Okay.
Oh, by the way, this is going to be my plug for a friend. I get no financial reimbursement for saying this, but I have a friend who created a company that's the Keho Foods, Keho, and they're vegan ketogenic foods. And they're delicious.
Keho Foods.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. No, they're really, the only problem is my wife is a mostly vegetarian, tends to get to them before I do when I order them, but Keho, yeah.
Right on. I will check that out. Thank you for that. Okay, let's transition to the enlightening lightning round.
Okay.
So this is a series of brief questions so this is definitely a shift in the pace with which we've gone, in the sense that my endeavor is to ask the question, step aside, keep us moving. For the most part, I don't plan to tug on your answers much.
Okay.
Question number 1. Please complete the following sentence with something other than a box of chocolates. Life is like a...
There you go again. Life is like a... I don't know. Wow. It's got to be meaningful. Can't just be a cute cliche. Okay. Life is like a huge game of chess.
Okay. Thank you. Number 2. Borrowing Peter Thiel's famous question, what important truth do very few people agree with you on? We might have just spent an hour and a half talking about it.
Yeah, we just spent a few hours talking about whether or not obesity is caused by eating too much.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Number 3, if you were required every day for the rest of your life to wear a t-shirt with a slogan on it, or a phrase or a saying or a quote or a quip, what would the shirt say?
There's never too much bacon.
Okay, thank you. Number 4, what book other than one of your own have you gifted or recommended most often?
Honestly, A.J. Liebling's The Sweet Science. Oh, no, let me take that back. Norman Juster's Phantom Tollbooth. Phantom Tollbooth.
Yeah, what a wonderful book.
Yeah.
That's great. What are you currently reading?
I read a lot of books simultaneously for my life, and the embarrassing thing is that now that I read on Kindle, I often forget what the titles are. So I'm reading a novel about the war between the Greeks and the Spartans. I'm reading The Three Musketeers to my sons because my youngest son got tired of me reading Terry Pratchett to them because Terry Pratchett was a little too confusing for him. I don't know if he likes The Three Musketeers, but I do. I read a lot of books on the sort of memoirs by scientists, books about science whose titles, I mean, they stack up around me on my desk. So
Right on. And you did mention The Sweet Science. Is that a book that you like, or you do recommend sometimes?
yeah, well, I boxed when I was younger and stupid, and was a fan of boxing for a long time, less so now. And A.J. Liebling was my favorite writer. That may still be, but Liebling wrote for The New Yorker from about late 1930s through 1962 when he passed away, and he wrote about Paris, World War II. He was a war correspondent. He wrote about boxing, and he wrote about the press. And those are all subjects I'm really obsessed with, or was obsessed with, and he writes about them in a way that makes you think you're there. So there are boxing matches from the 1940s that I feel like I've seen,
Wow.
or 1950s, because I read Liebling's description of them. He's
That's cool.
good.
That's great.
Yeah. And he's a wonderful prose stylist and very clever.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome. Okay, question number 5. So clearly you've traveled a lot in your life. What are some of the things that you do when you travel, or things you take with you to make your travel less painful or more enjoyable?
well, I actually haven't. I traveled a lot when I was younger, and for work, and I always traveled for work. So that was, in that sense, I'm not a good example, because I would always feel guilty on the trips that I wasn't working enough.
Mm.
And then I would feel guilty because I wasn't enjoying myself because I was trying to work, or feeling guilty about not working enough. Guilt is part of my DNA. So I can't really answer that question.
Okay.
Although I can say that I'd be happiest in life sitting in a cafe in Paris or Amsterdam with a cup of coffee, and I may or may not go back to smoking if I ever get there.
Fair enough. Okay. Question number 6. What's one thing you've started or stopped doing in order to live or age well?
Well, regrettably or not, I gave up most starches and grains and sweets. It is what it is, yeah. I don't eat those carbs anymore. I eat a lot of green vegetables. I gave up a lot of bad habits, in part because they didn't wear well with me. So
Yeah.
alcohol was another one. Nicotine was another one.
Mm-hmm. So. You'll live longer, right? I mean,
I might. The question is, will it feel longer? Because
That's right.
that old line about, I mean, even my friend who recently became a vegan, I want to say, I like animal products. Anyway, so yeah, I didn't do it so I'd live longer, though. I drink, I get depressed the next day. I spend the whole day wanting to cry. Even half a glass of wine will do that to me.
That's interesting.
So I don't drink. If you get a hangover, you can take aspirin. If you feel like crying all day long, there's nothing I found that could solve it other than not drinking. So I no longer, for the most part, I don't drink anymore.
Yeah, that's same with me. I gave up drinking a few years ago. I don't know how many years ago. And for me, similarly, I think it wasn't any kind of a moral thing. It was just, first of all, I think I'm less of an a-hole when I'm sober.
Yeah, I think that's true of all of us, yes.
Yeah, but also less impulsive and moody during and following. So I'm with you on that one.
So that was it. I gave up smoking because I didn't like the way I felt when I smoked. And I thought it was going to kill me in that case. So I didn't do it thinking I would live longer. I did it because I didn't want to get lung cancer. And the carbs, I gave it up as an experiment. I tried Atkins as an experiment 20 years ago, and I lost 25 pounds effortlessly. And by the time I'd done the research, I concluded that I'm pretty confident what I'm doing is not going to kill me in the short term, and I like the way I feel, so that's why I don't eat it.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, thank you. Number 7. If there was one thing you wish every American knew, what is it?
Carbohydrates are fattening. And obesity is a hormonal regulatory disorder. It's not caused by eating too much.
Okay.
I wish it was more interesting than that, but...
Well, you're nothing if not consistent and congruent. Yes. So there's something to be said for that.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, number 8. What's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about making relationships work?
Well, the cliche is to say listening, but also to be able to apologize without adding a but to the sentence.
Yeah. I hear you there, man. Okay, number 9. So we've talked about love. We've talked about aging. We've talked about pretty much all the eating, all the important things in life. We didn't talk about sex, and we're not going to, but we'll talk about money with this question. What is the most important or useful thing you've ever learned when it comes to money, or what's something you're always sure to do with it or never do with it?
Other than don't go into journalism if you want to feel secure in life, financially secure in life. I don't know. I mean, that you have to make more than you spend to to get by. Yeah, I don't have anything profound to say about money.
Okay.
I wish I did.
Okay. No worries. That's great. Okay. And speaking of money, something I have done as a gesture of gratitude to you for making time and sharing so generously of your knowledge and your experience is I have gone on the microlending site kiva.org, and I have made a $100 microloan to an entrepreneur named Ora Idia in Ecuador, who will use this money to buy seed and agricultural product to help improve the quality, which she will then sell that produce to improve the quality of life for herself, her family, and her community. So thank you for giving me a reason to do that.
Oh, well, my pleasure.
Yeah.
You should have David Bornstein on your...
I know that name. I don't know David. Who is he?
David, well, last I heard he was running a website that for journalists to actually write about solutions to problems instead of just problems. But he also, his first books are on micro-lending.
Interesting.
And,
is he someone you know personally?
I do, and I'd be happy to connect you. I think you would really like David. He's he's done wonderful things in the world.
Awesome. I'll definitely make a point to look him up, and thank you for that. Okay, so I've left us only a few minutes for the final part of the interview, which is about the writing process, creativity. I know I have a question about sentences. I want to ask that, and then maybe just what else you would say, what advice or encouragement you would leave people listening with when it comes to getting writing done, getting it out into the world. So really these 3 questions. Number 1, what does a typical day for you look like? Which I realize might be different when you've got a project, like a book or an article, but what's a typical day for you look like?
Okay. I mean, assuming the children are in school and not sheltering in place, and I have something I have to write, it's basically get up, have a cup of coffee, make the kids breakfast, get them off.
What time do you get up? You like one of these 4 a.m. guys?
Usually around, well, if they're in school, it's around 6:15, 6:30, okay. And they have to get on the road at 20 of 8 and get up to I'm only smart enough to write in the mornings. And so I try to dedicate my mornings to just writing. I don't like to write. To me, the process is Sisyphean. So the advice is, get up in the morning, roll the rock up the hill. And the next morning, get up. Long ago, when I started my career, when Discover Magazine was owned by what was then Time Life and then became Time Warner and then became Time Warner AOL, and I don't even know what it's called anymore. Calvin Trillin had been a writer for Time, and he used the phrase a vomit out, which is basically like you just I tend to freeze up when I write. I feel a lot of pressure. I start to get depressed. That feeds back negatively on the writing. It gets harder and harder to do. But if I get a first draft done, I know I could edit any first draft into something that's good. So you just get it out there. That's the vomit out idea. So just keep writing. Don't stop. Don't go back. Just get everything down that you want to say. And then, like a sculpture, getting all the clay in one place, then you could start shaving it into something that is worth reading. And I define it as worth reading is by the time I'm done, if it looks like something I would want to read if I hadn't written it. And reads like it was written by a better writer than I am. So
I like that. So you'll write in the morning, probably after you get the kids out the door normally. And 2-3 hours?
No, as long as I can, as long as the caffeine is working, go as long as you can. That's why I'll schedule interviews like this one for around 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock my time, because by that time I can't make progress pushing the rock, and so I can do other things that don't require that kind of mental effort. And then, ideally, I'm not good at this, but I should save all emails for the afternoon. I should save, paying bills for the afternoon, stuff like that, making phone calls for the afternoon. And again, there's only that I can keep writing. I feel like I'm smart enough till about 12:30, 1 o'clock, so I try to hoard that time. And then, like I said, my brain just doesn't do it.
Yeah. What, in your experience, what are the qualities of a great sentence, and how do we write more of them?
Qualities of a great sentence. I really thought about this. I mean, it's active. I was taught 40 years ago never to use a passive construction. The language is precise. The words are interesting. It's short and understandable, or as short as can be. And I'm definitely one of my problems as a writer is I tend to overload my sentences, and then part of the editing job is to chop them up so that people can actually digest them. I mean, you're trying to hit a balance between writing that's interesting and entertaining to read and that gets the point across. Remember, fundamentally, I'm a science journalist, so it's trickier. But ideally, a sentence should never be boring. There should not be a boring sentence, but what makes it interesting is harder to define.
Yeah. Do you like to write with music, no music?
If there's music, my brain tends to follow the music, although there are periods in which I will. When I start to get nervous, I might play opera or something because the lyrics are not in English. If I'm playing something that I'm not familiar with it, so I can sort of begin to get caught up in it. Because again, the idea is to focus on what I'm writing, not on anything else. But it's rare these days that I play music while I write.
When you write, what's your sense, if any, of the connection to the reader? Do you have specific kind of avatars or profiles in mind that you're writing for, or specific individuals? Does it change? Like that, something about that. What's your sense of being connected to the reader as you're writing?
Well, one of the problems when I read young writers is they're often writing to show off. They're not thinking about how their readers are assimilating what they're saying. So it's always about writing to a reader. The argument, especially what I'm doing, because it's like I'm arguing to a jury in a courtroom, and I'm presenting the evidence and I'm presenting the witnesses, and so everything has to be planned to get the jury to believe what I think they should believe at the end of it. So you're always writing to them, and the jury is the readers, or the readers are the jury. I don't know if I succeed, because sometimes I'm stunned by what people take away from what I wrote. And I think it's always the writer's failure. If they take away the wrong thing, you can't blame the reader. You didn't communicate it correctly, but you've always got to have a reader in mind. When I started at Discover, it was this sort of housewife in Kansas that they always talked about that had to understand. That must have been the iconic reader for Time magazine, because our editors had come from Time magazine. I probably shoot too high. One of the problems is that I tend to argue in my head with my critics, so on some level I'm writing to them. And now I'm writing above the level of the readers, and I probably lose readers because of that. I'm sure, if you look at some of the Amazon reviews, there are always going to be people who hate what you write, especially when you're arguing a controversial perspective. But yeah, it's always about the reader. Everything. Book my next book, which is about diabetes, I'm struggling. I have to write a couple of paragraphs in order to get a paycheck, because the case for Keto has been delayed because of the coronavirus, so the publication is not going to be at the end of the month. So suddenly there's no publication paycheck, and the only other way I can pay the bills is if I write 2 chapters of the book that comes after that.
Wow.
But I don't really know who I'm writing to yet. I haven't figured it out. On some level, I'm always writing to the medical research community, but there aren't enough of them to sell a book.
Yeah.
And if I'm writing to people with diabetes, then it's an entirely different tone, argument, sentence, structure. I mean, it's just everything about the book is different.
Yeah.
And I haven't figured it out yet.
Well, for what it's worth, I know you don't need luck, but I wish you luck with that, because I know that's a book that's going to bless lives,
Oh,
regardless
thank
of
you.
who you write it for. It's an important message, more important now than ever. What's your process? I know this could be a big question, but maybe there's a simple answer. What's your process for getting a book done from the time you settle on the idea to, the time you submit the manuscript to the publisher?
I have
I know that's big. Sorry.
I have small processes along the way. And even the diabetes book, it's a bit of a mess at the moment, so it may be the wrong time to ask me, because the one thing I'm not doing is following a process at the moment. Like I said, if you looked around my desk, I've got piles of books on diet where I'm trying to remember what was it I wanted in this book that I thought might be worth saying, and why didn't I write it down when I read it instead of just marking it, highlighting it, and sticking it in the pile? The fundamental, because what I'm doing is trying to understand something that's either controversial or not controversial and most likely wrong. The first step is doing an enormous amount of research. Basically, you keep asking questions until you get answers that make sense, and you keep talking to people until you realize that you've run out of people to talk to. Like everyone I interview, I say, who else should I interview? Every time I read an article, I look at the references to the article to see what other articles I should get that speak to this subject. So eventually the returns from each subsequent interview get smaller and smaller, where you realize that you have to start writing or you will go bankrupt because you've spent your advance. And now I keep notes for my interviews all in one file. I'll go through and sometimes spend as much or a month or 2 months just going back to the notes and actually sort of indexing them. And I have a technique I use to index my notes, so I know what everyone told me. I know what important things they told me. I've flagged the points they made or the statements they made that I think should definitely be in the book or maybe should be in the book. I have a system I use for that.
Is that system something you learned in your study of journalism, something you've created on your own, or something else?
It's sort of, some of my friends in journalism suggested parts of it, and then it kind of evolved from my earlier work. It's just a way that worked for me. Although I remember about a year ago somebody telling me about how a very famous journalist worked, and his system turned out to be very similar to mine in that sense. So, I'll go through all the articles and I'll create an index. So I'll have a file that indexes what I have learned. And then from that file, I can go through and pick out every major thing that I want to say. And I could kind of backtrack to the original interview or the original article and then fill in each point and build an outline. And every time I try to write, I invariably try to do it first without an outline, and I can't get it done.
Yeah.
You write for a few weeks and your points you're making curl up in a corner and die somewhere, and you go, okay. And then I realized that I'm going to have to do what I've done in every other major article and book I've ever done and actually do an outline first. So I do the outline and then start writing from the outline, and then you get into that vomit out process where it's just try to get through, say everything I want to say and get it down, and then I could edit it into something that's worth reading.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that and breaking that down. And I will wrap. I think this really is my very, very last question, aside from that advice and encouragement question, is what technology do you find indispensable?
The internet now.
The internet,
I wish it wasn't,
Word.
And Word, yeah. And that's.
Is there any other cool? Some people have, I think, creative answers to this, but like Trello, Evernote, certain voice recording apps, like anything.
I haven't. There's some terrific, and I'm going to forget the name of it because I've just been doing interviews where I've had to. Normally, when I do an interview with someone, I transcribe. I basically take notes as they're talking, and I could get about 90%, 80 to 90% of what they're saying. So then I'll use a way to record it through an app where you dial the app number and it starts recording, then you dial your source. So I'll have a backup of a recording if there's something I don't know. And then there's a great website where you could send interviews you've done and they will charge you $1 a minute. and do wonderful transcriptions. And but I feel if I don't transcribe it myself, I don't really process what they've said. There's something about like I'll tape interviews or record it, or even when I'm just talking to them. If it doesn't go through my fingers, it's almost as though I can't assimilate it and really process it. So if somebody else transcribes it, it's not as useful to me.
Yeah,
Although
I've heard others say something similar. There's something about that, for sure.
But the process of transcribing, though, can be nightmarish. When I finished the research for my first book, when I was at CERN, I told you I lived in, outside Geneva for 10 months, and then I went to Paris to write it. And I had this beautiful apartment in Paris. I was 29, 30 years old. I spent the first 3 weeks trying to transcribe 3 hours of interviews a day. And so that took me about 10 or 11 hours of typing to go through. And it got to the point that I'd have to buy, bombs for my hands but I just wanted to I had 75 hours of tapes to transcribe, and I just wanted to get it done. And I knew if I didn't do it immediately, these tapes would be wasted. And it was, there I am in the most beautiful city in the world in like March, April, in this beautiful apartment, miserable while I'm transcribing these tapes. So.
That's amazing. Well, hearing that, your commitment, the willingness to move immediately into action toward, a definite result, like these kinds of things, I'm really inspired by that. And I suspect people listening will be as well, because many people dream of writing a book, but they're not willing to put in that kind of effort. So,
well, the difference between being a professional writer is you don't have any choice. So it's sort of, in this case, I get this advance, I fly off to Geneva. Back then it was a tiny advance. I can't believe I lived for a year and 15 months in Europe on, a $30,000 book advance where you get half. You don't even, it's crazy. But once you're committed, you don't have any choice. You're not doing it as a hobby it's just... You've got to write the book. And because if you don't write the book, you got to give the money back. And you don't have the money because you spent it doing the research for the book. So it's an interesting life. And it's funny because some of the critics of that first book particularly were, I think I mentioned Christopher Lehman Howe talking about, he was just, you didn't talk about scientists the way I talked about it. I had seen some awful things in my 10 months embedded, but you're supposed to treat these Nobel laureate scientists with great respect and admiration, and I wasn't doing that. But what I had seen, I had to report what I had seen. It's just what I didn't really have any choice, although I could have done it better. He was certainly right about that.
Yeah, we can always do better.
Yeah.
Well, what, if any, what final advice or encouragement would you give to anybody listening who either wants to be a better writer, wants to be more productive as a writer, wants to make a bigger impact with their writing, anything related to the creative process or writing at all?
Again, I got lucky. I fell into a career that matched what talents I had to a subject that people cared about. On some level, I'd say however many books, 5 books, I've 6 books with Keto. I've all been on the same subject. They've all been on good science and bad science. And the first 2 books sold about 7,000 copies each because they were on high energy physics and cold fusion. And then they go up by orders of magnitude because they're on nutrition and something people care about. So, I don't really know how to answer. Part of it is just, like, I write because it's what I am and what I do. And I'm an investigative. It's become it's a manifestation of who I am. I don't know how to do anything else for a living, and I don't really want to do anything else for a living. And I think that it's as much a trap as it is something, a benefit that I have. But I think to do something meaningful and to have impact, it's got to be who you are.
Yeah. And
you've got to be willing to accept. My favorite line about publishing, this is the one advice I give to younger writers when their books are coming out, and I don't want to discourage them. But back in the mid-'80s, I heard this from a science journalist who had enough sense to leave journalism in the 80s, and he went out to Hollywood to become a showrunner for Law and Order. So he did very well. Last we heard from him, he was complaining about the contractors on his $10 million house, He said the month before your book comes out is the calm before the calm. Okay? And you've got to be willing that's the reality with huge proportion of all books that come out. Like I said, I've managed to escape it once I got into nutrition and obesity. But even then, it's my fear. The case for keto, I think I'm really proud of that book.
Is he meaning, so just to make sure I understand what he's saying, like that when the book finally is released, that there's not much ado because people don't really care?
Yeah. You expect things to change because you've spent years on this book, right? Ideally. And you go through the editing with your editor and the publishing process, and then you expect something to happen. And for the most books, it just doesn't.
Right.
And it's just, and there's always this fear that even with, like I said, with the case for keto, that's my fear, that despite everything, despite how good it is, despite the name I have, I'm not Michael Pollan or Malcolm Gladwell, so I'm not going to, I'm a level or two below them in writing, and it's just that nobody will care. I mean, now there's a world of, you write these books because you want people to care. You have something that you think has to be said, and you spend a lot of time saying it as well as you humanly can within constraints, and you want people to care, and often they barely notice because there's a lot going on in the world.
Yeah, more now than ever.
One of my best friend, she wrote a book that came out on September 11th, 2001.
Wow. And
you go to Amazon. That's the pub date, September 11th, 2001. It sold about 3 copies.
Wow.
To me and a couple of her other friends. It's just, you have to be able to deal with and there's thousands and thousands of books published every month.
Yeah.
And maybe 5% get reviewed. I don't know what the number is. And most of so it's sort of, you have to do it because it's what you do. Because in fact, almost because you have no choice. And then you have to be able to roll with whatever happens. How's that for inspiration?
I think there's something about that that's really beautiful, and it's honest. And to prepare people for the reality of this path, if it's what they choose. And I know, many times in life, we don't know whether something's our path until we're willing to walk it.
Yeah. So well, that's the thing. It's sort of, you make these decisions. Like I said, I went into physics. I wanted to be an astronaut because I read science fiction books when I was a kid. So I wanted to, explore strange new worlds and new civilizations and boldly go where no man has ever gone before. So that meant that I studied physics or astrophysics, which I did, except I wasn't really very good at it. So then I studied journalism, and I become a journalist, and then I managed to become kind of an investigative science journalist. And for the past 20 years, I've been writing, trying to change the world of nutrition and obesity science. There's nothing in my youth that would have prepared me for this, and yet this is what I am and what I do now.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I know this has been a lengthy interview, but as I said a couple times in the course of it, I've really enjoyed it. I suspect listeners will enjoy, anybody who's listened this far as well, who's interested in writing and creativity. I know they'll be taking away something useful from this as well. As I said too, I really acknowledge the work you're doing, and sorry to hear that. And I'm glad, I guess, to hear the case for keto has been pushed back. Hopefully it will find the audience it deserves, because of that.
Well, we hope. The publishers are dealing with, how do you publish books when bookstores aren't open?
Well, Amazon sells 80% of the books anyway.
Yeah, it was 50 last time I heard, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's more now. Yeah.
I had a call with Ryan Holiday. That guy that wrote Obstacle is the Way, Ego is the Enemy. He's kind of a, but he knows a thing or two about publishing and has an agency, where he works with some of the top, people in personal growth and inspiration and things like that. But yeah, no matter, he also told me there's kind of what you were pointing to. There's more than 1 million books on Amazon that have 0 sales. That's amazing. So there's definitely an art, and there's luck, timing, and other factors.
It's like buying a lottery ticket. And if you're really good and your publishers are really behind it, it's like buying 100 lottery tickets. And then you can get, a reviewer who's in a bad mood that day. Or maybe his last book didn't sell. And, it's an interesting world. Let's just say if my kids decide they want to be journalists and writers, I'm not sure I'm going to be the most supportive dad. Although I haven't figured out what I would like them to do other than something meaningful that ideally, I guess, helps people. I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Well, Gary, thanks again for making time. I really appreciate this. I'm so glad we've connected, and I will look forward to staying connected with you online and wherever our paths cross in the future.
Terrific. Thank you, Brian. This has been enjoyable.
Despite living in an age where we have more comforts and conveniences than ever before, life isn't working for many people. Whether it's in the developed world, where we're dealing with depression, anxiety, addiction, divorce, jobs we hate, relationships that don't work, or people in the developing world who don't have access to clean water or sanitation or healthcare or education, or who live in conflict zones, there's a lot of people on the planet that life isn't working very well for. If you're one of those people, I invite you to connect with me at goodliving.com. I've created Life's Best Practices Breakthrough Coaching to help you navigate the transitions that we all go through. Whether you've just graduated school, you're going through a divorce, you just got married, you're headed into retirement, you're starting a business, you just lost your job, whatever it is you're facing, I've developed a 36-week course that you go through with me and a community of achievers and seekers who are committed to improving their own lives and the lives of others. So through this online program, you will have the opportunity to go deep into every area of your life, explore life's big questions, create answers for yourself in community, get clarity and accountability. If that's something you're interested to learn about, I invite you to contact me directly at brian@brianmiller.com or by visiting goodliving.com.